key role in spreading information, organizing efforts, and inspiring people to take part. For the Chinese media, too, it was a moment of truth. Hundreds of journalists converged on the site from around the country, determined to report on the spot despite regulations restricting them to their home provinces. Their determination was inspiring, and more impressive still was the quality of the reporting, which brought the disaster powerfully to life. Nor did these journalists shrink from what quickly became a central question: why had so many schools collapsed? The tremor destroyed more than 7,000 classrooms and killed well over 5,000 children. In town after town, the pattern was the same. The local school lay in ruins, while many nearby structures survived. Soon a disquieting theory took shape. Corrupt officials had creamed off construction funds, and children had been sitting in tofu buildings, shoddily built structures that didn't meet the earthquake code. It wasn't long before the authorities reasserted their control of the media. Instructions went out to stress the official narrative of brave troops rescuing survivors and delivering aid under the direct leadership of Premier Wen Jiabao. Overnight, the faces and voices of grief-stricken parents vanished from China's screens. Instead, Wen Jiabao was everywhere, personally directing platoons of soldiers one minute and calling out messages of hope to trapped people the next, then turning up at hospitals to comfort the injured. The celebrated dissident artist Ai Weiwei had arrived in Sichuan 10 days after the disaster and quickly took up the school's issue. In an attempt to document the scale of the tragedy, he launched a citizens' investigation to gather the names of children who had been killed. He went public with a list of 5,190 names and estimated that the government's official school death toll of 5,335, issued without names, represented around 80% of the true figure. The government clamped down quickly and hard on the story, restricting media access, harassing and arresting researchers, and deleting Ai's blog posts. In the end, a number of activists on the issue were jailed, and when Ai returned to Chengdu to testify on behalf of a fellow researcher, he was intercepted and beaten up by the police, later undergoing surgery for a brain bleed. A promised investigation into the school's scandal never rendered a public verdict, and attempts by parents to seek redress through the courts were squashed. Instead, they were offered pitiful compensation, with a barely disguised message of, "Take it or else." There was a sense afterwards of an opportunity lost, of disappointment that the generosity and energy of ordinary people, the initial instinctive professionalism of the media, and the dynamism of the internet had been met with censorship and cover-up. The year 2008, despite the glory of the Olympics, was tough for China. Whether despite the games or because of them, it marked the end of a brief period of openness in the mid-2000s and set off a cycle of authoritarian control and repression that has only worsened over the last 8 years. The stage was set for this by another cataclysmic event that occurred 2 months before the Sichuan earthquake. On March 14, 2008, violent riots broke out in Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. The trouble began when police arrested a group of monks who were demonstrating on the anniversary of the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, a revolt against Chinese rule that had been bloodily suppressed and which saw the Dalai Lama flee into exile. The uprising's anniversary each March is always a time of heightened tension in Tibet, and in 2008, things turned ugly, with protests for the release of the monks escalating over a couple of days into violent rioting and looting. Lhasa businesses owned by Han Chinese settlers and the ethnic Hui Muslim minority were attacked. Years of frustration at what many Tibetans saw as the colonization of their country welled up in what eyewitness James Miles of The Economist described as ethnic hatred. There were reports of deaths among both the settlers and the rioters, though accurate numbers were impossible to ascertain. Trouble soon spread beyond Lhasa and across the Tibetan plateau to the neighboring provinces of Qinghai, Gansu, and Sichuan. For the Chinese Authority, this was a political earthquake. As soon as trouble broke out, they shut down outside reporting, screening grim riot footage on state television while blocking all foreign websites in China that might carry a different narrative, from the BBC to YouTube. For many of us in Beijing, it was our first encounter with the real power of China's Great Firewall. Up until then, getting around internet censorship had been easy. There were free virtual private network VPN services that you could find on the web with a few mouse clicks. But when the riots started, every one of these went dark, Even the powerful VPNs used by business people and journalists struggled, constantly switching servers to stay ahead of the censors. Suddenly, we saw the truth. The government applied just as much censorship as they needed to and kept the real firepower in reserve. So a few people read The Guardian on a normal day. "We know who you are," the government seemed to say, "and we can cut you off whenever we need to." A grimly amusing incident soon rammed home the message about the government's stranglehold on information. A week after the riots began, my husband, working in a Beijing office, managed to get the Times on his computer for just long enough to read a detailed Tibet report. He quickly saved it as a Word document and tried to email it to me, but his Gmail crashed. When it happened twice, he realized the government was scanning outgoing Gmail messages for forbidden words, so he used a code to mask the offending vocabulary, renaming Tibet as Glebe, a Sydney suburb, and China as Cronulla, while the Dalai Lama became the mayor of Glebe. That should fix it, he thought, and resent the attachment. Crash. He tried again, substituting bad behavior for riots. Again, the firewall prevailed. After many edits, he eventually got the report through, but only after reducing it to nonsense, which is pretty well captured in these first 3 paragraphs. Thousands of Cronulla Boy Scouts and Parascout Cubs fanned out across Glebe and neighboring provinces of Cronulla admitted for the first time it had paintballed Glebe protesters. State-controlled New Flower news agency reported 4 people were paintballed and bruised last weekend by Boy Scouts in a Glebian area of southwestern Cronulla, as the forced to live abroad Glebe mayor expressed fears a crackdown on bad behavior had caused many casualties. The government also acknowledged for the first time that pro-management of one's own affairs, unrest in Glebe had spilled into the other far-flung corners. All this heightened the irony. A few months later, when foreigners arriving for the Olympic Games found that the internet was open and uncensored despite what they had read, the game organizers had built a kind of Potemkin World Wide Web. In the Olympic Village and in foreign hangouts, the Great Firewall was switched off. Elsewhere in Beijing and all around the country, censorship was as tight as ever. Barely had the Games ended on August 24th, then another scandal dragged questions of government transparency and openness into public debate. The news broke that suppliers to a major Chinese dairy company, Sanlu, had been stretching profits by watering down their milk and then spiking it with melamine, a nitrogen-rich chemical that can mask dilution by boosting the apparent protein content of milk. Melamine's toxic effect on human kidneys has been known for many years. Tragically, the adulterated product had been turned into infant formula and shipped around the country, killing 6 babies and putting 54,000 in the hospital. What made the scandal so corrosive was the nagging suspicion that officials had sat on the news until after the Olympics to avoid a national public relations problem. The evidence shows that responsible people further down the line knew of the problem for some time before the news came out. Nothing pointed to collusion at the top, but to many ordinary people, the story added up to political considerations trumping public welfare. It also seemed to say that, for all the achievements of economic reform, the government had not managed to build a system that offered protection against greed, incompetence, or corruption. Food security remains a huge issue in China, and even today, Chinese tourists to Hong Kong and developed Western countries go to enormous lengths to ship foreign-name brand baby formula home to China. As 2008 drew to a close, a group of activists made a bid for the year to mark something truly historic, the most thoroughgoing proposal for democratic reform in Chinese history, in the form of a public manifesto. The signatories invoked the solemn power of the anniversaries being celebrated that year, 100 years since China wrote its first constitution, 60 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 30 years since the opening of Democracy Wall, and 10 years since China signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. They called their manifesto Charter 08 and posted it online on December 9th, in the eve of the 60th anniversary of the adoption by the United Nations General Assembly of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The text of the charter had been refined over months, during which time Liu Xiaobo became one of its main sponsors. He was zealous in gathering signatures for the charter, and by the time it appeared on the internet, 303 people had put their name to it. China has many laws, but no rule of law, the charter declared. It has a constitution, but no constitutional government. The result was corruption, decay in public ethics, crony capitalism, inequality, environmental degradation, and a sharpening animosity between the government and the people. At the same time, the charter stated, "The ruling elite clings to authoritarian power and fights off any move to political change." The document acknowledged the many improvements to people's lives that had resulted from the reforms of Deng Xiaoping, but argued it was now time for more fundamental change. Charter 08 called for a new deal for the citizens of China, a guarantee of fundamental human freedoms and human rights, equality before the law, and the protection of private property. The Charter's governance proposals would seem straightforward to a student of Western democratic systems, but they kicked away the underpinnings of one-party rule. The document called for separation of powers, an independent judiciary, legislative democracy, constitutional rule, and depoliticization of the public sector and the army. Perhaps most radical of all was its proposal for a federated China, in which not only the differing interests of Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan could be accommodated, but also those of ethnic minorities within China's borders. The Charter posed a stark question. Where is China headed in the 21st century? Will it continue with modernization under authoritarian rule, or will it embrace universal human values, join the mainstream of civilized nations, and build a democratic system? Charter 08 was breathtaking in its boldness, and yet among the 303 initial signatories, there were government officials, members of official think tanks, and leaders of workers' and farmers' groups. Posted online, it garnered another 12,000 signatures before the government shut it down. Liu Xiaobo never saw the charter go live on his beloved internet. On December 8th, the day before it was posted, the police arrived at his apartment late at night to take him away. It would be 6 months before he was formally arrested, and a year before he would have his day in court. Over the following months, many signatories to the charter were harassed and others detained, and the government used all its newly honed skills to scrub the charter from the internet in China. Meanwhile, the Chinese media was warned not to interview any of the signatories or allow them to write articles for publication. The signatories saw reform as an urgent matter, but the government felt itself under no pressure. Events seemed to be running in their favor. At the end of 2008, the global financial crisis, GFC, was tilting the balance of economic power towards China. It was not the Olympics that would further the government's ambitions for global leadership that year, but raw economic power. On September 15, 2008, the giant American financial firm Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. There was no longer any doubt that the world's economy was in crisis. The Chinese economy had been slowing for months, and by early October, the factories of the Pearl River Delta were emptying out as millions of workers were laid off. Demand for Chinese manufactured products was drying up as the world slipped into recession. In November, China announced a staggering 4 trillion RMB, $586 billion US stimulus package. Nearly 40% would go towards public infrastructure, and another quarter towards rebuilding the parts of Sichuan hit by the earthquake. The spending would provide employment for the millions displaced from manufacturing jobs. The global knockoff effect helped keep Australia out of recession, and China's intervention in Asian currency markets gave support to the economies of Southeast Asia and South Korea. China went on a building spree, the biggest the world had ever seen, constructing highways and housing estates, bridges and railway lines. It drove the country to a GDP growth rate of 9% in 2009, while most of the West was in recession. When in 2010, China passed Japan to become the globe's second-largest economy, talk of an alternative China model of development grew ever more respectful. Perhaps, wondered some observers, there was a viable road to prosperity through centralized control of the economy and an iron hand on dissent, an alternative to the democratic route, and one that might point the way for other developing economies. It would be a few years before the downside of this success emerged, in a ballooning debt and an oversupply of real estate, and in the appearance of ghost cities which had been built for populations yet to arrive. Corruption, already rife, was turbocharged, and the gap between the free-spending rich and the increasingly embattled poor became extreme. But in 2009, the government basked in its successful management of the crisis, which they took to be an endorsement of their muscular style of government. The art world bubble burst immediately after the Olympics were over. Olympic spending had kept it inflated, but now the gathering GFC sucked the hot money out of the market. The Olympics year had not been a great one for art in Beijing. The success of China's leading artists had turned contemporary art into a honeypot, so the streets of 798 and the studios of the Songzhuan Artists' Village were full of knockoffs going for eye-watering prices. Some of the big-name artists were even prepared to rip themselves off, endlessly reproducing the work that had made them famous. Now with the GFC, the carpetbaggers decamped, and along with them hundreds of Songzhuan's wannabe artists. The commercial galleries thinned out, and scores of shows were canceled. Most of the established artists felt relieved. They were off the treadmill and had time to think. It was 30 years since the stars had hung their works on the railings outside the National Art Museum of China. What kind of society did they now seek to portray? 30 years after the beginning of the reform, China was changed beyond recognition. More than half the population now lived in the cities, in a country with rural traditions stretching back for millennia. More than 10% of the population now had no ties to place, but floated in search of work. And a nation which had once been driven by a powerful ideology was now offered nothing more profound to believe in than the drive for material gain. When I had returned to China in 2004, I had been struck by how many of my young colleagues at CRI were religious. Some were exploring Buddhism and Taoism, but others told me they were Christians. Among the rights lawyers and civil society workers, too, I discovered there were many Christians who would point to their faith as both inspiration and support. The best figures showed Christians at less than 1% of the population in 1978, but by 2007, they were more than 4%, with their numbers growing at a rate of 10% a year. Religious tolerance had been one of the reforms instituted by Deng Xiaoping, and since 1978, it had been enshrined in the Chinese constitution. 5 religions were specifically recognized: Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism. But the religious leaders were left in no doubt about who was ultimately in charge. The Vatican was allowed no place in Chinese Catholicism, and the Dalai Lama was demonized. The Chinese government even arrogated the powers of the Dalai Lama to themselves. When the second holiest figure in Tibetan Buddhism, the Panchen Lama, died in 1995, the Chinese rejected the Dalai Lama's choice for his reincarnation, naming another child instead, and spiriting the Dalai Lama's nominee away, never to be seen again. Despite the supervision of the faiths, the ranks of believers swelled. The religions were offering something that the government couldn't. They offered a moral system and a connection to the transcendental, while the government offered only material comfort. Faced with a society riven by exploitation and inequality, the government preached the need for a harmonious society, above the right to organize or to protest. The Communist Party, which had once sold itself with the most extravagant and inspirational slogans, now offered only this widely mocked bromide. Where, I wondered, were the artists in all this? By 2009, I was working as the art editor for the Beijinger, a local English-language magazine. The year was the 30th anniversary of the Stars exhibition, and it gave me a reason to take a longer look for a survey article I wrote for the magazine. It was the research for that piece that cemented my friendships with a number of the artists in this book. In the spring of 2009, Zhang Shaogang was working on an exhibition he would title The Records, a reference to The Records of the Great Historian, a foundation historical work of China. Since he began to paint his Bloodline series in the early 1990s, his work had been heavy with history. In the 2000s, he continued to explore how the past weighed on China. In the first decade of the new century, he had begun a series called Amnesia and Memory, which concerned both the need to remember and the necessity to forget. In many of the paintings, the human subjects looked away from the viewer, or their eyes were closed or blindfolded. Simple objects, a bare light bulb hanging from a flex, a rotary dial telephone, a fountain pen, carried the weight of memory. Now with The Records, he decided to consider, he told me, the contradictions between memory and forgetting that underpinned contemporary Chinese life. Because our country is developing by destroying things, we are living in a very contradictory situation, he explained. Memory is something basic in our nature. You are born with it, and it is basic to culture too. It comes to us naturally. But we are living in a situation where memories are constantly being erased. You have to face the changes in your life, but sometimes it is quite cruel to do that, so people get lost and confused. Zhang Shaogan is deeply thoughtful, widely read, and a prolific diarist and letter writer. In The Records, he wasn't ashamed to display his own confusion and sense of loss, as he mined his journal for private thoughts which he wrote directly onto the paintings. In one he wrote about his hometown of Kunming in the far southern province of Yunnan, a place traditionally renowned for its temperate climate and graceful beauty. Her purity is long gone, and disintegrated when she was forced to have a facelift. Long ago, her modesty was replaced by luxury. Her kindness was covered up by sophistication. Her kind-hearted nature was stolen by various deceits. Her uniqueness was remodeled with the excuse of globalization. Her face revised into passages of low-grade advertising. Her body turned into one after another false stock market speculation. She became a true guinea pig and selling agent, a beautiful excuse for a small group of people to make profits. That's just how it is. Our hometown has become a legend, a Godot that won't turn up anymore. His whole exhibition was perfectly matched to the atmosphere that pervaded 2009, a year of heavy anniversaries, from the simple objects he portrayed to his musings on what had been lost in the years that had brought China to this point. He had chosen this time to paint on polished metal, so looking at the works, you often have the strange sensation of seeing Zhang Shaogan's thoughts projected onto your face, as if his thoughts of loss, of confusion, and of hope had somehow become your own. My research also gave me a chance to catch up with Huang Rui, whom I had first met some 3 years earlier. In the summer of 2006, I had left CRI and taken a job for a while as director of a small gallery in the 798 Art District. As it happened, it gave me a ringside seat on the struggle, then reaching a climax to save 798 from developers. When the military factories had first been abandoned in the district, the newly constituted 7-Star Huadian Science and Technology Group was given the job of maximizing profits from the site. Their plan was to transform 798 into a high-technology park, but this would take a while. Meanwhile, when a few scruffy artists in foreign galleries turned up in the early 2000s, 7-Star was happy to take their money until it was time to move them on. But they didn't count on the passion of Huang Rui and his colleagues, who said they were going to secure 798 for art, and meant it. Huang Rui saw the potential of 798 as a permanent safe zone for art, and from the moment he and his partners issued their manifesto in 2002, their strategy was to tell such a powerful story about the area that it would become untouchable. Together with his partner Bernice Angramy, Huang Rui established an annual international arts festival based around 798 in the spring of 2004. By 2006, the Dashangzi International Arts Festival was attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors over a 3-week program of open studios, theater, music, parties, and exhibitions, and played a vital part in establishing 798's credibility. Meanwhile, the artists lobbied the Beijing government to declare 798 a permanent art zone, highlighting its attraction to the international audience who would soon be arriving for the Olympic Games. The year 2006 began with all the tenants of 798 under a threat of eviction. 7-Star did what they could to make life difficult, banning new tenants and then outlawing subletting by the old ones too. Rents soared. In the spring, a local district cultural inspection team arrived at 798 to censor any works or exhibitions deemed to cross the invisible line. The team in turn sent the police to enforce their rulings. No one was surprised when Huang Rui was one of their main targets. Much of Huang Rui's work is subtle, relying on wordplay or performance, but the inspection team had no trouble spotting the satire behind his collage entitled Chairman Mao, 10,000 RMB. Chinese people live with Mao Zedong's image every day. His face is on every large banknote. Every time you visit an ATM or reach into your wallet, there he is. The irony that the great communist should now be so indelibly linked to money was not lost on Huang Rui. When Mao was still alive, the most popular slogan was the one that called for his long life. "Long live Chairman Mao" was emblazoned everywhere, including on the walls of the factories of 798. In Chinese, the slogan is literally 10,000 years to Chairman Mao, and it was this number that Huang Rui decided to play with. In his work, the slogan was rendered in a collage of 100 yuan notes totaling 10,000 RMB. "Long live Chairman Mao," the banknotes said. The inspection team ordered the work removed immediately from view. Despite all their spoiling efforts, by the end of 2006, it was clear that Seven Star had lost. Designated a protected cultural zone, 798 was Beijing's third biggest tourist attraction when the Olympics rolled around. But Seven Star couldn't resist one last act of revenge against the person they blamed for their defeat, Huang Rui. In late December 2006, Seven Star served him with an eviction notice. The other tenants of 798 quickly mobilized in support, and Huang Rui announced a sit-in at his studio. He made the protests into a formal exhibition, holding a series of talks and seminars, and conducting a daily public dialogue with a different art world figure over a pot of tea and porcelain cups. For 11 days we joined him, drinking endless cups of tea and debating art and life into the night. Finally, the eviction date was well past. Huang Rui had made his point and consented to leave. Seven Star had won the battle, but Huang Rui had won the war. 798 was safe. Huang Rui maintained his cafe in the heart of 798, and that's where I went to meet him in 2009, where he remains today. Nearby is his office, which still overlooks the alley on the corner where his studio once stood. From his eyrie, he can keep an eye on the comings and goings of a place of which he is still, despite all Seven Stars' efforts, the unofficial mayor. On January 10, 2009, Cao Fei declared RMB City officially open. She had built it in Second Life, an online world then some 5 years old, where hundreds of thousands of role-players lived out alternative existences. Cao Fei had been hanging out there for a couple of years and, under the guise of her avatar, China Tracy, had found that in Second Life she could act out a truer version of herself. For years she had been fascinated by the way fantasy could be used to escape reality. She had found fantasy among the factory workers she had documented in Whose Utopia, and among the cosplayers of Guangzhou, kids who dressed up as their favorite manga characters and played out their stories on the rooftops, construction sites, and vacant lots of their increasingly homogenized city. Now she had found the greatest realm for fantasy of all, on the internet, a place where you could connect with others around the world in ways that weren't possible in real life. And so she had built RMB City, a fantasy Chinese urban realm where Tiananmen Square had been turned into a swimming pool and a panda's portrait had replaced Mao's on Tiananmen Gate. Situated on an island, her city had a Hong Kong-like cluster of skyscrapers and other spaces into which she invited other artists and arts institutions to adopt avatars and move right in. In her city, she said, everyone could live out their virtual dreams. "I want to build a utopian city in Second Life," she told me as she prepared for the city's grand online opening, "because you can't do it in real life." The same month, I found Jia Aili living inside a gallery in Beijing. He had moved in November and planned to stay till spring. He would paint all night and sleep all day. He called it his hibernation. His project was under wraps when I dropped in, but I could see it was a gigantic canvas, 6 meters high and 12 meters long. He was hoping his winter exile in the gallery would ensure he finish it. He had already given it a title, "We're from the Century." He had moved to Beijing in 2007. He'd come for an exhibition of his paintings, but once he had seen the gigantic studio spaces in the capital, he knew he had to stay. He threw in his job as a lecturer at the prestigious Luxin Academy in Shenyang, to the horror of his parents. He could be a teacher, and instead he wanted to be a painter. What on earth was he doing? Luckily, he found success quickly. His poetic, beautifully painted canvases evoke the tragedy of China's Rust Belt and the destruction of the old communist system in a wasteland of fallen idols and tangled wire. In many of the paintings, he appeared as a pale figure wandering naked, clad only in a gas mask. He had bought the mask in a shop in Shenyang and adopted it as a kind of talisman. The mask was of the kind the Soviets had designed during World War II and then exported to East Germany and into China. It seemed a suitable symbol for the destruction that surrounded him in his home province, where the very air seemed filled with dust and despair. He didn't manage to finish We Are From the Century during his time in the gallery, and he was still working on it when I came to visit him for the first time in his studio in spring. He had taken over an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city, and I wondered whether its monumental size conjured up for him the deserted spaces he had wandered as a teenager. The painting was incredible, a sprawling panorama of a fallen world. Dominating the foreground was a crashed plane and a giant hammer and a sickle lying among the wreckage. Children wandered through the blasted landscape, while in the distance a statue of Lenin lay broken on its side. Towards the back of the composition wandered a figure in a spacesuit. Jia Aili spoke matter-of-factly of the monumental changes that had taken place in his lifetime and which lay behind this painting. He told me he was interested in exploring the secrets behind modern history and its endless implications, a history whose objective reality was often hard to grasp. Everyone knows what's happened in China and the whole world in the 30 years since I was born. I'm simply a northerner. I've experienced the 4 seasons, the germinating of my body and my mind, and the loss of faith. Elsewhere in Beijing in the spring of 2009, Anwar was reconnecting with an experience that years before had changed his life, an experience which had intensified his senses of the immensity of nature, something that made him determined to create work that embodied its force. In 1987, he had spent 100 days exploring the Taklamakan Desert, which lies at the heart of Xinjiang. The Taklamakan is studded with ancient cities lost beneath its dunes, and its shifting sands have a well-earned reputation for treachery. But it exercised a powerful attraction to Anwar, who had been born on its fringes. In the summer holidays that year, his fellow students had been encouraged to go out and explore their country in preparation for their final year at college. Most of them had headed for the special economic zones, but Anwar had decided to return to his homeland. Over a number of weeks, armed with a sketch pad, compass, dried food, and 3 canteens of water, he made 2 or 3 day sorties into the Taklamakan and out again. His idea was simple: to feel the desert, to walk alone. But then on a journey to a place called Black Sand Mountain, he lost his way. He'd been told that when he reached the mountain, he would be able to see his way back from its summit. But when he arrived, all he could see was sand. Faced with endless dunes, he began to doubt his compass and finally chose a direction and stuck to it out of sheer desperation. Unable to sleep for fear the sand would swallow him up, he hiked for 5 days, battling panic and thirst, forcing himself not to drink his last canteen of water. Finally, he saw a group of trees on the horizon. In the Taklamakan, where there are trees, there are people. He felt a flood of relief mixed with fear that his senses were playing tricks. It was only when he smelt the sap on the air that he knew he was safe. Years later, he could still remember the rough sensation of the bark against his skin as he embraced it to make sure the trees weren't a mirage. "I was transformed by that experience," Anwar told me, "and I found new hope. After I had been through all that confusion and found my way again, I understood more about the true relationship between life and art. I knew what real art is, and I knew I could only make art." He wasn't interested in the material, the political, or the pop. He wanted to explore realms of artistic expression where words have no place. Over a decade since the late 1990s, he had developed his own abstract language of painting. The vivid colors and their layering on the canvas, often over months, stroke by considered stroke, gave his work a mirage-like illusion of depth and space, which Anwar thought as their force field. Since his experience in the desert, he had wanted to find a way to engage nature directly in his work, and in 2008, he had finally found one. That spring, he had moved into a new studio with a courtyard, just as he was starting to work with water-soluble oil paints. His idea was to give the physical and the sensual phenomenon of weather and the seasons a role in his creative process. He took canvases he had worked on for many months in the studio and placed them face up in the open yard. There, he dripped pigment from above, letting the breeze scatter and drag it across their surfaces. Then he waited for one of Beijing's famous spring or summer storms to break, allowing the first drops of rain to fall onto the canvases and pool, resulting in an opalescent quality. When all the elements cooperated, the pieces were finished in a single afternoon. Others were painted by the wind in January and completed by a rain shower in April. When I visited him in the late spring of 2009, he'd been using this unique version of plein air painting for more than a year. The canvases set up around his studio suggested not just of wind and rain, but of stars swirling in space. But the day I arrived, he wasn't painting on canvas. Instead, he was working with hundreds of felt mats, rolling them one by one into tubes, which he then adorned with a single stroke of blue paint. He'd been asked to participate in a group exhibition about sound and music, and faced with the prospect of contributing still more noise, he decided instead to offer silence. The rolled mats, made out of a kind of woolen felt that in Xinjiang adored nomads' houses, were going to line a room in the exhibition venue. Tightly placed side by side, the mats would cover the four walls and the roof until the room was perfectly insulated by the soft wool. He remembered how it had been years before, when he had been studying for his university entrance exams, and he had to cocoon himself away in the wool dyeing room to read. There he remembered it had been so quiet that he believed he could hear the sound of his blood pushing through his body. "The absence of sound will help you to really hear," he told me. "You will hear what's inside your body, not outside. You will hear your own body living." I smiled quietly at Anwar's idea, but I still went to the exhibition. It was called Music to My Eyes, and it sprawled out over multiple floors of a new private museum in the capital's CBD. Searching for Anwar's felted room, I came upon a strange darkened box tucked away in a far corner of the show. Inside the box on a screen, I saw a video of a girl. To a soundtrack she'd remixed of a Chinese punk rock hit, she was working her way along a whitewashed wall, painting, then erasing, then painting again, changing her clothes from a slick gangster-like suit to a white wedding dress to a bikini and a platinum wig, stripping naked in between, then painting again. From time to time, she would pick up a can and spray paint the question, "Isn't something missing?" She painted a headless man in a suit, a graffitied hokusai octopus ravishing a naked woman, a fleshy-lipped man in close-up reclining on his side, as if viewed from a neighboring pillow. And then she spray-painted across his face, blacking out his eyes and tagging, "Miss you, miss you." Finally, she returned to the wall to its whitewashed state, leaving behind a scroll LED sign which kept on asking, "Isn't something missing?" over and over again. The work was exhilaratingly angry and exhausting, with its cycle of creation and destruction played out to a screeching soundtrack. I loved it. "I want the audience to feel pain too," the artist told me when I met her later, "because everyone is missing something." Her name was Pei Li. She was 24 years old and disarmingly fresh-faced when I met her, despite the cauldron of emotions brewing inside her. Her video had been inspired by a failed love affair, one that had left her in the hospital after she drank so much vodka in her despair that her stomach had begun to bleed. "I liked the taste of it," she told me, not specifying if she meant the vodka or the blood. She came from a generation born in the 1980s, children of the one-child policy, the generation that older Chinese kept saying had no depth or insight. Cao Fei once described them to me as the Instagram generation. "They don't look at anything for long," she said. "For them, it's all snapshots." But Pei Li wasn't like that at all. She looked at everything with intensity, and in doing so, she made me look at China in a new way. What she reminded me most of were the poets I had once drunk with under the stars at the old summer palace. She told me she wasn't even sure she wanted to be an artist. Maybe she just wanted to be a punk. Later she would tell me about her traditional upbringing in Changzhou, in the heart of what I always thought was as willow pattern plate China, deep in the Yangtze Delta, a country of classical gardens and jasmine tea, of arching stone bridges and silk embroidery, of poets and pagodas. She had gone to art school in Hangzhou, famous for its West Lake, which had been celebrated by poets and painters over centuries, and which was now home to China's version of Silicon Valley. She'd studied new media and video there, and Isn't Something Missing had been her graduation work. They hadn't thought much of it, she told me. I wasn't a very good student. I'm often angry. If you have strong emotions, it's better to create than destroy, isn't it? She asked and didn't wait for an answer. I think in everyone's deepest heart, there's a violent side, and I want to use that violent side to create. 20 long years of living separated her from the artists who had come of age at Tiananmen Square. But it was as if she had drunk from the very same source they had done in the late 1980s, when hope was new. I thought of what Pei Li had said about her anger when I went to Shenqi's exhibition just a few weeks later. It was June and the 20th anniversary of Tiananmen had just passed. Shenqi had started experimenting with painting in 2002, and for a long time he'd struggled for a style that would capture the mood of sadness he wanted to convey. His first efforts, he told me, were too romantic, too beautiful, too much on the surface, and he kept looking for something more spicy, more harsh. Finally, he found a dripping technique with paint, which gave his canvases the impression that rain, or tears, were running down them in rivulets. He chose to work predominantly in red and black, colors that to his eyes embodied bravery. "If you have enough courage to stand up, you will be heard," he told me. "If I chose black and white, that would be weak, but black and red shows courage. To stand up is to be bloody." Now he had completed a body of paintings that he would show in June 2009, 20 years after, and in honor of the events that had changed his life. It was only a day or two since his show had opened, but it looked as if the place had been ransacked. Many of the walls were blank except for the labels showing where the missing works had been. Shenchi wearily told me how it had gone down. On the day of the opening, the police had arrived promptly to take down works that offended them. First among these was a painting of a smiling policewoman in full dress uniform and holding up a 100 RMB note as if it was her police badge. "They thought I was implying there was a connection between power and money, and they didn't like it," he told me. Then he added, "I was saying that, of course." The objection to a second group of paintings was more overtly political. These were paintings that featured Chairman Mao. In one, a giant statue loomed over a prostrate crowd. In another, a bust of Mao stood on a square filled with tiny people. Rendered in red, the chairman's head dripped across the black and white figures. But the paintings that they had let remain still told the bloody story Shenchi wanted to convey. One showed crowds of young people seated in Tiananmen Square, their figures black and white, the square washed with red. Another showed a young woman lying as if sleeping, the paint weeping across her body. Yet another depicted crowds sheltering under umbrellas, as if shielding themselves from grief. A few days after my visit, the police shut down the whole exhibition. They also arrived at Shenchi's studio to give him a warning. It was polite enough, but the message was clear. After a decade of trying, he knew he had to leave China once more. "I thought, I don't have any famous family to protect me from trouble. I am a son of nobody, so I have to go." In 2010, 12 years after he had returned home to China, he flew out again for London. Days after I saw Shenchi's truncated exhibition, I took a walk through 798, wondering whether anyone else had dared to show work about Tiananmen. There I found a gallery that had built a steel-reinforced room with a porthole through which you could view the show. Inside the room, a fire hose set to full blast kicked and arched, spraying water at the glass. The power of the water was extraordinary, and despite the steel rivets, a little of it still escaped to wet your face as you peered in. The title of the show was Freedom. And then in December, Liu Xiaobo was finally brought to trial. He had been charged with incitement of subversion of state of power. There was no doubt that he would be found guilty. At the trial, he tried to read a statement, but the presiding judge cut him off after 14 minutes, ruling that his statement in defense could not be longer than the statement by the prosecutor. 14 minutes was all the time it had taken to argue that he should be imprisoned. "June 1989 has been the major turning point of my life," he began, describing a life which was then just over half a century long. It was this event that had made him a dissident. In the statement, he declared that he had no enemies and no hatred, and spoke of his love for his wife, Liu Xia, who had not been permitted to attend his trial. "Your love has been like the sunlight that leaps over high walls and shines through iron windows, that caresses every inch of my skin and warms every cell of my body. Even were I ground to powder, still I would use my ashes to embrace you." Calmly, he made the case for his innocence and spoke poignantly of his optimism for a time when China will be a land of free expression, a country where all political views will be spread out beneath the sun for citizens to choose among, and every citizen will be able to express their views without the slightest fear. Westerners can read this message of hope in the full published text of the defense address, but the judge never heard it. Liu Xiaobo's time to speak had by then run out. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. The next year he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. His wife, now under house arrest, was not allowed to attend the ceremony in Oslo. The Nobel medal stayed in its small wooden box, and Liu Xiaobo was represented on stage by an empty chair. Chapter 10. Amnesia and Memory. We gathered our provisions on the way. In roadside shops we bought incense, candles, long red coils of fireworks, and paper money. The goose was waiting for us at the village, Guo Jian's cousin told us. We were traveling in convoy. Guo Jian, his cousin, 9 of his former classmates, and me, on our way to sweep the grave of Guojian's grandfather. In spring, at the festival of Qingming, pure brightness, on April 5th, Chinese people around the world gather at the graves of their ancestors to honor them and make offerings. This would be the first time Guojian had performed this traditional duty for his grandfather. The day had started hazy and cool, but by the time we were nearing his grandfather's village, the sun was burning hot and bright in a brilliant blue sky. As we headed south towards the border with Guangxi province, the limestone karst peaks grew sharper against the horizon, and the foliage a deeper green. We had begun the day in some hilarity, but making our way through the fields to the gravesite, our mood turned solemn. We walked in silence, all of us in a single file except for Guojian and an old auntie from the village who had joined us to help carry bamboo sheaves to place around the grave. Everyone carried a separate offering, white mourning streamers to hang from the bamboo, rice spirit for a libation, fireworks, candles, incense or paper money. In the lead, Guojian's cousin carried a beautiful gray and brown goose, its feathers scalloped and white. Dangling by its legs, it curled its neck up to look at the sky. The grave was in a remote spot far from the village's official cemetery. It was in a patch of uncultivated ground, a place designated for outcasts, for babies, or for others who were deemed to have died too soon, a place for the unlucky and the unblessed. Guojian's grandfather had committed suicide at the age of 37, inside a mountain cave where he had taken shelter from the communist forces in 1951. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, had entered the southern province of Guizhou in 1950 as they pushed south to complete the takeover of the country, which Mao had declared as the People's Republic of China in October 1949. Before the communists came, Guojian's grandfather had been a small farmer whose education had singled him out as a leader. He was a respected figure in his village, but a modest man. When he was approached to represent his district at the National Assembly of China's pre-1949 nationalist government, he had declined, writing simply that he was very proud to be nominated, but too humble to go. But in the new People's Republic, even before this tenuous link to the nationalists was discovered, his status as landlord meant that he was doomed. The fact that his teenage son, Guojian's father, was off fighting with the PLA elsewhere in the country was of no account. He fled from his village into the safety of the hills, but someone reported the smoke from his cooking fire. With the cave surrounded, he decided to shoot himself rather than give himself up. The soldiers tied his body to a plank and carried it down to the village, where they paraded him like a trophy through the streets. His wife, Guojian's grandmother, could only stand and watch. Later, his body was dumped outside the village in outcasts' graveyard. It would be more than 30 years before Guojian's father could raise a gravestone on the spot, and 40 years before Guojian persuaded his grandmother to tell him the story. By the end of 1951, almost 2 million landlords had been murdered in China as part of the process of communist land reform. In this period, Mao set a nationwide goal that 1 person per 1,000 should be killed. But in Guizhou, where popular resistance was strong, the toll rose to 3 dead per 1,000. There was never any chance that Guojian's grandfather would have survived if he had not cheated the party by taking his own life. His 2 brothers would die, too. One would be executed, and the other would commit suicide, overdosing on opium that was smuggled to him in prison. We gathered quietly around the grave. Guojian set out small porcelain cups at the base of the gravestone and filled them with rice spirit, while his auntie set up lighted candles. On a small mound above the site, we planted the bamboo sheaves and hung them with white strips of paper for mourning. Guojian's cousin quietly took out a small scythe-shaped knife and slit the goose's throat, letting the blood fall on the stone in front of the grave. Each of us stepped forward to dip paper money in the blood and set it on fire, waving the smoke towards the sky. Guojian and his cousin knelt, and with bundles of incense smoking in their hands, bowed to the grave 3 times, filling the air with scent. Finally, they unrolled a long coil of bright red firecrackers, snaking around the gravestone and up onto the slope, then down around the graveside once more. In his final act of homage to his grandfather, Guojian lit the fuse, and we stood back as the cacophony echoed off the hills, ricocheting from peak to peak until the whole valley filled with sound. After the final explosion, the thunder rolled on, as if the hills themselves were applauding. The next day, Guojian and I walked along a disused railway track, the same rail line that he had taken as he headed off to war 35 years before. The line was being diverted for a new ring road around the city, part of a grand plan to connect his hometown Duyun with a neighboring town to create a new megacity, Dayun, Big Dayun. The village he had grown up in had almost entirely disappeared. The Dayun of his youth had nestled below the hills, but the new one fought with them, confronting them with skyscrapers and massive bulldozers, which would level any that stood in the way of development. One hill had already been trucked away to make room for a development zone. I used to be able to walk up the hill at the end of my street and look out on beautiful landscape, Guojian told me. Now walking around the town, I can hardly even see the hills for the buildings. In these small places, they are so in fear of being left behind that they embrace development, however bad, he said, even if it is meaningless and of no benefit to them. All around China there is this fear of being luhou, of being left behind, of being poor, being backward, and so you can't argue with development. It was hard to find much beauty in Dayun, but it struggled on in pockets. The river where Guojian had learned to swim still ran through the town, and children still played in its fast-flowing water. Behind his school a small hill still stood, covered in ferns and wild rhododendron. He had spent much of his teens playing there, skipping school and raiding the nearby orchards for apples and bayberries. In the streets there was no sign of the traditional dress of the Buyi and Miao people who still dominated the town, but the women at least kicked against the dictates of conventional fashion. Proudly made up, they tottered down the streets in off-kilter boots or sparkly high heels, dressed in lace filigree, lame and embellished leather, heavily embroidered pullovers, and plush-tight skirts. Guojian's parents no longer lived in the town, and the house where he grew up was no longer identifiable on his old street. But some of his old friends were still around, not just the classmates from high school who had shared the pilgrimage to his grandfather's grave, but the ones who had run wild with him when he was just a boy. These friends had grown up with him on the same street, sharing everything in their poverty. One friend's mother even suckling Guojian's younger sister when his mother's breast milk was exhausted. Guojian wanted me to meet them. While his schoolmates had sought out steady jobs and modest comfort, his old street companions had taken chancier and more colorful paths through the new China. One had grown rich as a professional mahjong player, another had ended up as a gangster's bodyguard in Shenzhen, a third was driving his own taxi, while his wife ran a restaurant where we met for lunch. Around a meal of bamboo rat stew, the four of them traded stories of long-lost friends. In the 1980s, it had been a popular choice to go to Shenzhen. Less than 20 kilometers from Hong Kong's border, the new special economic zone had quickly become home to smugglers, drug traffickers, gamblers and pimps, and the tough Duyun boys had made their name as fighters and prized underworld recruits. One of their friends, the smartest of the lot, they said, had become a gangster himself, accumulating wealth and power before falling foul of a rival gang. No one knew for sure, but they assumed he was dead. The one-time gangster's bodyguard stayed quiet through most of this conversation. He'd become an alcoholic while he was away, and he drank steadily through lunch. He was heavily tattooed and missing most of his teeth, a scary sight for those who didn't know him. But he spoke kindly and slowly for my benefit in standard Mandarin Chinese, and opened the car door for me later as we got into their friend's taxi to drive up above the town and look at the view. The last stretch was too steep for the car, so we walked, winding our way up the hills in the shade of the firs, the sunlight filtering through their soft needles onto the ferns that grew in abundance on the forest floor. Birds darted across our path, and there was a smell of honey on the air. Up here, you could see how beautiful Guizhou province could be, until you turned to look at the view. Back in the town, giant diggers were eating away at a hill, leaving just the rind, its hard exposed and churned red soil that stood out against the green of the remaining wooded slopes. In the city again, Guojian and I walked through the streets, looking for landmarks from his past. He found the small bridge over a canal where 30 years before he had met the recruiter from the Minzu University who had changed his life. The water was full of rubbish, much of it brightly colored packaging. Guojian photographed it, focusing on the wrappings that featured the faces of Chinese celebrities, actresses endorsing soap or toothpaste, comedians selling instant noodles. Rubbish culture, he observed with a laugh. When Mao declared the People's Republic in 1949, honoring the dead at Qingming was outlawed along with other such displays of feudalism. But in the years following his death, China's leaders started positioning the government as the inheritor rather than the destroyer of China's traditional past. They recognized the power in these ancient customs and endorsed them as a way of usurping them. In 2008, they declared Qingming a public holiday. But while this stroke of the pen was meant to pronounce the government's respect for the right to remember, the kind of remembering that is tolerated remains tightly circumscribed. Each year the government presides over a massive state-imposed act of forgetting about the events of 1989. In 2014, the 25th anniversary of the Tiananmen Massacre, they would go to greater lengths than ever to prevent even the smallest act of remembrance, imprisoning people who held private memorials, keeping victims' relatives under police surveillance, scrubbing the internet clean of any reference, and even sending foreign students out of Beijing to keep them from sharing the information with their Chinese classmates as the June 4th anniversary loomed. In the wake of the Tiananmen Massacre, the government conducted public mourning for the soldiers who had died in the crackdown, but there's never been any public act of mourning for the demonstrators and ordinary Beijingers who were killed, and attempts by the bereaved to have victims' names listed have been blocked. The government handed down its official verdict on the events in 1989, declaring the demonstrations a counter-revolutionary rebellion, and they have resisted all calls since to change that judgment. Since 1989, history and memory have been key battlegrounds for the government in a war that they are determined will be fought and won on their terms. This insistence extends far beyond Tiananmen events to other disasters of the People's Republic, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and beyond, setting the correct line on the whole sweep of what they like to call China's 5,000 years of civilization. In their version of history, the 100 years leading up to the declaration of the People's Republic was a century of humiliation at the hands of foreigners, which was only ended by the triumph of the Communist Party in 1949. In this narrative, the party is China's historical savior, and the only force that can ensure the nation's continuing rise. With breathtaking nerve, the party claims credit for the defeat of Japan on Chinese soil in 1945, a grueling feat that was almost entirely achieved by the national forces, the Communist Party's rivals in the Chinese Civil War, who were crushed in the Communist victory of 1949. In 1989, as he prepared to send the troops into Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping mused that the biggest mistake the government had made had been to neglect the proper education of its young people. Too much had been made of the mistakes of the communist era, and too much respect paid to what China could learn from the West. A new program of patriotic education must be instituted to ensure young people were reminded of what the party had saved them from, a series of humiliations by the same Western countries whose systems the Tiananmen demonstrators had pointed to for inspiration. Accordingly, since 1990, all Chinese students have taken compulsory courses on the Century of Humiliation, which begins with the Opium Wars and runs through the war with Japan and only ends with the triumph of the Communists in 1949. Man-made disasters such as the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution are reduced to mere missteps on the otherwise glorious road of national rejuvenation. When I first arrived in China in 1986, the Cultural Revolution was discussed everywhere. The so-called 10 years of turmoil from 1966 through 1976 had weighed heavily in the balance in judging Mao Zedong's legacy. True, most of the commentary focused on individuals rather than the ways in which the system itself had contributed to the disaster. It was also true that, rather like in France, where everyone alive during World War II claims to have been a member of the resistance, in China, you only ever seem to meet victims of the Cultural Revolution, never perpetrators. But there was a general acknowledgement that the period must never be forgotten, and that remembrance would ensure that such a disaster would never again engulf China. However, as I write in 2016, 50 years after the beginning of the Cultural Revolution, the period has been reduced to not much more than a footnote in China's textbooks. Young Chinese have very little conception of what happened in that time. Their ignorance is so profound that, in recent years, fashionable youngsters have embraced a kind of Cultural Revolution chic, as if the period was only about unisex clothing and army surplus. The approved historical narrative is laid out in China's National Museum, situated on Tiananmen Square opposite the Great Hall of the People. There you can view a permanent exhibit entitled The Road of Rejuvenation, which takes the visitor on a journey from the semi-feudal, semi-colonial society to which China had been reduced at the time of the Opium Wars of the 19th century to the Glorious History of China under the Leadership of the Communist Party. In this exhibit, you'll find whole rooms and dioramas devoted to the humiliation meted out to China by the West, and yet search in vain for more than one ill-lit picture to illustrate the Great Leap Forward, during which tens of millions of Chinese died. The proverbial Martian visitor would conclude that during the 1960s, nothing notable happened in China at all, save a successful hydrogen bomb test. Needless to say,